The sky above Kent was a shattered mosaic of contrails, smoke, and sunlight when Oberleutnant Karl Henner's Bf 109 finally gave up its last breath. He felt the engine seize before he heard the whining death rattle, a violent shudder that rattled his bones and snapped the horizon sideways. Flames licked up from beneath the cowling, oily and hungry, smearing the canopy glass with streaks of black. Behind him, the channel glimmered like a distant shield he no longer had any hope of reaching. Kent spread beneath him in slowly sharpening fields, hedgerows, and roads, no longer abstract shapes on a map but a place that would swallow him whole. His instructors at Wernuchen had drilled the bailout sequence into him until it became muscle memory, and now his hands moved without needing permission from his stunned mind. Canopy latch, pull. Harness, unclip. Push away from the dying machine as the slipstream tears against limbs already trembling. For a heartbeat, he was weightless, suspended in a moment between life and annihilation. Then the universe yanked him upward as his parachute deployed with a savage crack. The sudden silence descended like a cloak. Below him, his burning fighter spiraled downward in a final, hopeless dance. His heart hammered like it wanted to abandon him midair. And as he drifted downward through the September quiet, Karl tried to remember exactly what they had told him about the British people waiting on that ground. Monsters, they said. Savages. Civilians who would tear him apart. He swallowed hard, feeling his thoughts unravel as steadily as his altitude decreased. The patchwork of England sharpened into details, a church steeple piercing the afternoon light, a lane curving around cottages, a handful of tiny figures sprinting across a meadow toward where he would land. Karl's stomach twisted into a knot. He tugged on the parachute lines, but pain shot through his ankle as he hit the ground too hard, tumbling sideways, the landing roll breaking into a clumsy collapse. Grass scraped his face. His ankle screamed through his boot, throbbing in a way he knew meant trouble. Voices rose, English, quick, sharp, too close. Karl clawed at the harness, stumbling out of the collapsed chute. He reached automatically for his Luger, but hesitated. There were too many of them, and he was already injured. He froze as three figures vaulted over a stone wall, men in civilian clothes carrying shotguns. Home Guard. Behind them more villagers appeared, women in aprons, an older man gripping a walking stick, even a child clutching something that looked like a cricket bat. Karl lifted his hands instinctively, fear coiling tight in his gut. His breath came in shallow gasps as the nearest man leveled the shotgun at his chest. Sweat trickled down his spine. The man's weathered face was stern, lined by years of sun and fieldwork. When he spoke, his accent was thick, but his meaning cut through the tension. Deutsch? Karl nodded, bracing himself for cruelty. Instead, the man lowered his shotgun, slightly, and asked in broken German, "You hurt?" Karl blinked, thrown off balance more by the question than by the landing. He pointed to his ankle. Twisted. The man shouted to someone behind him, and an older woman hurried forward. Kind eyes. Steady hands. Karl felt the world tilt again, but for a different reason this time. The woman knelt without fear, her apron fluttering in the breeze as she examined Karl's ankle with practiced gentleness. Her touch was firm, professional, not hesitant. Karl winced as she pressed along the bone, evaluating the damage. Sprain, she said to the Home Guard man in English. Get him inside before it swells. The man nodded. His name, she said, was Harold? Harold. An enemy with a name. The villagers supported Karl on either side, guiding him across the pasture toward a small thatched-roof farmhouse. The scent of soil, smoke, and late summer vegetables drifted in the air, so ordinary it felt unreal. The boy who had followed them stared at Karl with a mixture of fear and fascination. Inside the farmhouse kitchen, warm, cluttered, alive, the woman eased Karl into a chair. A basin of water appeared. She unlaced his boot carefully, peeling it off without inflicting more pain. Karl gritted his teeth but did not cry out. The cloth she wrapped around his ankle was torn from a bedsheet. Her hands never trembled. She did not speak to him, only worked with quiet efficiency. When she finally spoke, it was just one word. Tea. Carl blinked again, bewildered. Tea? He had been told to expect mobs, hatred, violence. Not tea. Not domestic warmth. Not a grandmotherly figure tending to him like a wounded traveler instead of the enemy who had flown over her country with intent to kill. For a moment, Carl wondered if he had died somewhere between the cockpit and the ground and was dreaming all of this. Harold, the home guard farmer, sat across from Carl at the table. His shotgun was propped harmlessly against the wall now. He took out a pack of cigarettes and, after a moment's thought, extended it toward Carl. Carl stared. Smoke curled lazily from Harold's lips as the farmer lit both cigarettes with the same match. "London, U-bomb?" Harold asked in slow German. Carl swallowed. "No. Fighter. Escort. Protect bombers." Harold nodded, though his eyes briefly clouded with something painful. "My son," he said after a moment, tapping his chest, "is soldier. France." He gestured toward the window, toward a world now divided by war. Carl stiffened, expecting anger. Instead, Harold only exhaled smoke and added one word, one universal expression of disgust. "Skies." Carl's lips twitched despite himself. Yes. War was shit. He didn't need fluent German to feel the truth behind the man's tired eyes. The woman set a chipped teacup in front of Carl. He wrapped both hands around it, letting the warmth seep into his trembling fingers. Outside, villagers clustered at the windows, peering in as though he were some kind of strange creature. But no one barged in. No one hurled curses. No one raised a fist. Harold looked at Carl with a mixture of sternness and reluctant empathy, as if he were trying to reconcile the uniform with the young man wearing it. Carl took a sip of the tea. Hot. Sweet. Human. Nothing had ever tasted more out of place and more comforting at the same time. A police constable soon pedaled into the farmyard, his bicycle skidding slightly on the gravel. He stepped inside with an air of practiced formality, clipboard under his arm, mustache trimmed with military precision. The constable's eyes landed on Carl, then on the wrapped ankle, and then on Harold. A quiet conversation unfolded between them in English, brief, orderly, devoid of panic. Then the constable addressed Carl in careful German. "You are now prisoner. Military will come. You stay here. No trouble." Carl nodded. No trouble. He could hardly stand, let alone run. The constable accepted his own cup of tea, of course, because the British, Carl was beginning to understand, seemed to believe that tea was a universal remedy for all crises, including the capture of enemy pilots. As the constable filled out a form, Carl glimpsed lines for name, rank, time of capture, condition. He found himself struck by the quiet absurdity of it all. Warplanes burning in fields. Villages shaking under the echo of gunfire. Cities bombed. And yet here, in this kitchen with floral curtains and a kettle humming on the stove, bureaucracy No German passed between them, no English. Just silence. And yet, somehow, Wilhelm understood the message in the man's eyes: you're safe. For now you're safe. When the military truck arrived, the soldiers handled Wilhelm firmly but without cruelty. One translated the postman's final words: he hopes you get home to your family when this war ends. Wilhelm felt something in him soften, though he could not name it. By late autumn, hundreds of captured German airmen sat in British POW camps scattered from Yorkshire to Wales. And the stories spread like sparks through dry tinder. One man had been given tea before even being disarmed. Another had been sheltered from an angry crowd by a grandmother wielding a broom like a general. Another had received stitches from a village doctor who muttered about the foolishness of young men in war, treating him no differently than he would treat a local farm boy who had fallen from a tractor. Some pilots had not been so lucky. Caught by furious Londoners still grieving the Blitz, they suffered beatings before police could intervene. But even those men, bruised and bitter, admitted that individual civilians had tried to protect them. That elderly woman who stepped between a mob and a wounded pilot became something of a legend among the prisoners. They spoke of her with awe, as though she embodied something impossible. Something they had not been told existed. In huts filled with damp air and quiet murmurs, the prisoners compared notes. For many, the reality clashed violently with the narratives they'd been fed. The British were not animals. They were not monsters. They were people, angry at times, frightened at times, compassionate at times. Human. The Luftwaffe had pounded into every young mind a simple narrative: the enemy is cruel. The enemy hates you. The enemy will kill you if given the chance. And yet, Karl could not forget the grandmother's hands as she wrapped his ankle. Wilhelm could not forget the postman's steady voice or the cricket bat-wielding men who had chosen not to strike him. The contradictions were too strong to ignore. In the dim barracks, men whispered their doubts. If they lied about this, one would murmur, staring at the ceiling. What else did they lie about? Some insisted it was all British strategy, an act to make prisoners compliant. But most knew better. The kindness had been too natural, too immediate, too inconsistent to be orchestrated. A farmer offering cigarettes. A boy staring with uncertain curiosity. A pub owner refusing to let a drunken crowd harm a downed pilot. These were not scripted acts. They were spontaneous ripples of something deeply ingrained. Something their instructors had never prepared them for. Humanity. The realization unsettled many of them more than any interrogation ever could. In early November, after weeks of quiet reflection, Karl finally wrote to his mother. His handwriting trembled slightly, not from injury, but from the enormity of what he was trying to express. I am being treated well, he wrote in carefully composed lines that he knew would pass through British and German censors alike. They follow the rules here. The people are different than what we were told. He hesitated, then wrote another sentence he doubted would survive censorship. I do not understand why we are fighting them. It was dangerous even to imply such thoughts. But Karl needed to send some trace of his bewilderment across the channel, needed to let his mother know that the world was larger and more complicated than the propaganda had allowed. Wilhelm, on the other hand, felt a biting anger, not at the British, but at those who had shaped his beliefs. They lied to us, he told a fellow prisoner. They made us afraid of people who gave us tea. He paced the barracks, energy restless, resentment simmering. How could he reconcile the warm eyes of a British postman with the enemy he had been ordered to fear? The questions gnawed at him. The air was heavy with the kind of darkness that presses on the chest before a storm, and Eric felt it wrap around him as the British soldiers led him into a dimly lit barn far from the burning fields he had fallen through. The space smelled of hay, damp soil, and quiet human fear, the kind that grows in places untouched by the violence of the front lines. He could hear cows shifting in their stalls and a soft humming from a lantern swinging lazily above, casting shadows that moved like living things upon the wooden walls. The officer who guarded him was young, barely shaving age, yet his hands trembled with a heavy responsibility he never asked for. The war had pushed boys into roles meant for hardened men, and Eric could feel the weight of that transformation in the soldiers' uneasy breaths. Every so often, the officer glanced toward the farmhouse outside, as if he were not guarding a German pilot but a memory he wished he could forget. Eric sat on a bale of hay, cold seeping through his torn uniform, and wondered how he had come so far from the sky he trusted. Through a small gap in the wooden wall, he watched the faint glow of distant fires where planes had crashed, both British and German, and in that light he sensed a thin line separating enemies from the shared fate they lived. The wind whispered through cracks, carrying not the sound of battle but the muffled laughter of a child somewhere in the house nearby, a reminder that life still clung to the world despite the chaos sweeping over it. The thought made Eric close his eyes and breathe, for the first time feeling something he had not felt since he was a boy: quiet. The door to the kitchen creaked open slowly, and Eric was guided inside by the young British soldier who seemed almost relieved to leave the barn. The room was warm, lit by a fire burning steadily beneath a blackened kettle, its steam rising like the soft breath of home itself. At the wooden table sat Mrs. Whitford, a woman with silver-streaked hair pinned neatly behind her head, and eyes that carried both sorrow and iron resolve. She looked up from the bowl of water she had prepared, offering no smile, no judgment, only a quiet acknowledgment of a wounded human being standing at her threshold. Eric felt the sting of shame as she motioned him closer, his uniform torn, face streaked with soot, boots leaving a trail of mud on the clean floor. She dipped a cloth into the warm water and began to clean the cuts on his cheek, each gentle movement contrasting sharply with the violence he had brought from the sky. The soldier stood awkwardly, unsure if he should intervene, but Mrs. Whitford's stern glance kept him silent. On the shelf behind her were framed photographs of two men, one young, wearing an RAF uniform, the other older, smiling with a softness Eric recognized instantly as fatherhood. Both were gone, taken by the war long before their time, yet here she was tending to a German pilot who might have once flown in raids against cities like hers. The fire crackled as if reacting to the tension, and for a long moment no one spoke. Then Eric whispered a soft "Danke," uncertain if the word even belonged in such a place. Mrs. Whitford paused, looked into his eyes, and replied only, "War does not decide how we treat each other. People do." Her voice carried more power than any weapon he had ever seen. Morning arrived as a pale wash of gold across the land, filtering through the thin curtains of the small guest room where Eric had been placed under watch. The bed beneath him was old, springs creaking each time he shifted, and the blanket was rough but warm, an unexpected gift for someone who had fallen from the sky just hours ago. He lay awake long before the sun rose, replaying every moment of his landing, each second of terror when his parachute dragged across the fields, and the distant roar of British fighters circling overhead. In the quiet, he heard footsteps outside his door, Mrs. Whitford moving from room to room as she had done before the world changed. When she entered with a tray of bread and tea, her eyes showed no softness but a firm sense of duty, the kind that came from years of surviving hardship. Eric sat up slowly, unsure whether he deserved such kindness, and as she set the tray down, he noticed a faint tremble in her hands. This was not mercy born of naivety. It was the strength of someone who had lost and still refused to hate. They shared a silence so deep it felt like an invisible bridge between two nations at war. Later that morning, a British intelligence officer arrived, tall, stern, wearing a coat that still smelled faintly of the coast's salt wind. He questioned Eric with a calm sharpness, yet even he seemed unsettled by the domestic scene before him, an enemy pilot sitting at a British family's table, eating bread baked by the mother of an RAF airman. The officer's questions slowed, his tone softened, and by the time he left, he looked back once, as though witnessing something he would never fully understand. Eric watched from the window as the officer's car disappeared down the dirt road, and in that moment, he realized that the true battlefield was not only in the skies but in the choices people made when no one was watching. When the time came for Eric to be transported to a prisoner of war facility, the sky above the farm stretched wide and cloudless, a silent reminder of the world he once ruled from the cockpit. 2 soldiers escorted him across the dirt yard, their boots crunching on gravel, their expressions a mixture of duty and faint discomfort. They had heard rumors of pilots who were beaten by civilians, or stoned as they were marched through towns scarred by raids, yet here stood a man who had slept under a British woman's roof and eaten at her table. Eric glanced back at the farmhouse one last time. Mrs. Whitford stood in the doorway, arms folded, watching with the detached strength of someone who had carried loss far heavier than a single night's danger. She did not wave, and he did not expect her to. But in the stillness of the moment, there was an acknowledgement, mutual, silent, and more profound than any farewell. As the military truck rumbled to life, Eric sat in the back, wrists bound loosely, the wind from the open road cooling the burn marks on his cheek. The landscape rolled by, hedgerows, fields golden at their edges, patches of forest whispering secrets, older than war. He realized that everything he had been taught about the enemy, about cruelty, rage, indifference, did not match the reality of the woman who had washed his wounds and the young soldier who had guarded him with a trembling sense of responsibility. In the distance, he saw a formation of British Spitfires cutting through the sky with sharp elegance, and for the first time, he did not see them as predators but as men like him, caught in a machine far larger than themselves. As the convoy moved forward, Eric felt something shift inside him, not a betrayal of his homeland, but a deep understanding that humanity was not bound by uniforms, borders, or flags. It rose wherever people allowed it to survive. When the war finally ended, the world exhaled the breath it had been holding for 6 long, suffocating years. Cities lay in ruins, nations scarred, and millions carried grief that could never be counted in official numbers. Eric returned to Germany thinner, older, and carrying memories that felt heavier than the medals once pinned to his chest. He rebuilt his life piece by piece, repairing windows shattered by bomb blasts, planting new roofs over old foundations, and finding work in a small aviation workshop that tried to salvage the remnants of machines once built for destruction. Yet of all the moments that haunted him, none returned more vividly than the night he had spent at the Whitford farm. He often pictured Mrs. Whitford's steady hands, the fire crackling behind her, the photographs of her son and husband whose fates he never learned. In quiet evenings, he wrote letters he never sent, trying to find words that could bridge the silence between former enemies. In 1951, he finally found the courage to address an envelope to the Whitford family, Kent, not knowing if the house still stood, or if the woman who saved him still walked the same wooden floors. Weeks later, a reply arrived. It was short, written in a careful hand. "We remember. And we are glad you lived." No signature, no details, just a simple acknowledgement of a shared moment in history that refused to fade. Years passed, and Eric kept that letter folded in his wallet until the paper grew thin and fragile. He married, raised children, and grew old, but whenever he looked at the sky, whether filled with peaceful clouds or the echo of propellers in his memory, he knew that humanity had survived because people like her chose compassion in a time that rewarded cruelty. He died long after the war ended, surrounded by family, yet in his final moments he whispered of a farmhouse in England, a woman who had treated a stranger like a human being, and a night when kindness had been stronger than the war that tried.